Welcome to the DX Today podcast, your daily deep dive into the AI ecosystem. I'm Chris, and joining me as always is Laura.
I'm thrilled to be here, Chris, because today we get to dig into what I think is quietly becoming the single biggest constraint on artificial intelligence. And surprisingly, it is not chips.
Okay, you have my attention immediately, because almost everyone I talk to assumes the bottleneck for AI is GPUs and advanced silicon. So tell me, what is the real constraint you're pointing at?
It is electricity, plain and simple, and the numbers are genuinely staggering. Global data center electricity use hit 448 terawatt hours in 2025, and it is forecast to blow past 1,000 terawatt hours by the end of this year.
Wait, so we are talking about data center power consumption more than doubling in roughly a single year, which sounds almost impossible for any kind of physical infrastructure to actually keep up with in practice.
That is exactly the problem, and it gets sharper when you zoom into the United States specifically. Goldman Sachs projects American data center power demand climbing from 31 gigawatts in 2025 to 66 gigawatts by 2027.
For listeners who do not live and breathe energy statistics, can you translate what a jump from 31 to 66 gigawatts actually means in terms that they can genuinely picture inside their own heads?
Sure, think of it this way. A single gigawatt roughly powers about 750,000 homes. So we are effectively adding the electricity appetite of tens of millions of households just for AI in about 2 years.
That framing really lands. And it makes me wonder, if the demand is exploding that fast, why can the power companies not simply build more capacity and connect these data centers the way they always have before?
Because the grid moves on a completely different clock than AI does. And this is really the heart of the whole story. Data centers want power in months. But grid upgrades and new connections routinely take many years to complete.
Give me the concrete picture here, because I keep hearing horror stories about connection queues, especially in the big data center hubs. How bad has the waiting situation actually gotten in a place like Northern Virginia lately?
It is almost hard to believe, honestly. In Northern Virginia's data center corridor, a brand new facility can face up to 14 years just to get a grid connection. And even the typical Dominion customer waits around 7 years.
14 years is not a connection delay. That is basically an entire technology era in AI terms, given that the models we are using today did not even exist 14 months ago, let alone a full 14 years.
You have put your finger on the absurdity of it, and the backlog behind those waits is enormous. Dominion Energy alone has roughly 70 gigawatts of projects sitting in its queue, and it can only connect about 10 large customers a year.
So if I'm doing that math even roughly in my head, a 70 gigawatt queue cleared at 10 large customers per year implies a waiting line that stretches out for several years at absolute best?
At best, and that assumes nothing new joins the line, which of course is a fantasy given how many fresh AI campuses are being announced every single month. The queue keeps growing faster than utilities can possibly drain it.
This has to be killing projects, right? I cannot imagine a company committing billions of dollars to a data center campus and then just calmly accepting that it might sit dark and useless for an entire decade.
You are absolutely right, and the casualty numbers prove it. Somewhere between 30 and 50% of planned data center projects in the United States are now delayed or canceled outright, purely because of grid and interconnection bottlenecks.
Half of them, potentially. That is an astonishing failure rate for an industry that is supposedly the hottest and most well-funded corner of the entire global economy right now. So what are these companies actually doing about it?
They are doing the only thing that desperate, deep-pocketed companies can do. If the utility cannot give you power fast enough, you go out and build your own generation. And the industry even has a name for this, behind the meter.
Behind the meter, okay, unpack that phrase for me, because it sounds like clever accounting jargon. But I strongly suspect it describes something with much bigger physical and political consequences than the innocent little term suggests.
It really does, and here's the core idea. Instead of waiting to plug into the public grid, a data center builds its own dedicated generation right on site. Most often natural gas turbines that they can order, install, and fire up in a fraction of the utility timeline.
So essentially, the world's largest technology companies are now becoming their own private electric utilities, which is a genuinely wild reversal of how we have organized power generation and distribution for basically the last 100 years.
Exactly. And the money flooding into this space is a flashing signal of how serious it has become. Just this month, National Grid unveiled a $1.75 billion strategic investment in a power developer called Joulent.
And presumably, Joulent is not building solar farms and wind turbines with that money. Given everything you just told me about the desperate need for speed and reliability, So what exactly is that 1.75 billion actually buying?
Joulent's entire pitch is dedicated fast-track generation built specifically for hyperscale AI data centers on timelines that traditional utility interconnections simply cannot match. National Grid is essentially betting big that raw speed to power is the new competitive moat.
And that single deal is clearly just one visible piece of something much larger, because when National Grid of all the players starts moving this aggressively, you know the whole industry structure must be shifting underneath our feet.
The whole industry is consolidating around exactly this, and the scale is honestly jaw-dropping. Analysts are now tracking an estimated $200 billion wave of utility mergers and acquisitions, driven almost entirely by the AI data center power boom.
$200 billion in utility deals is the kind of number that reshapes entire regional economies. But I want to push on something, because building your own gas turbines to dodge the queue raises an obvious and thorny question.
I think I know exactly where you are going, and you are right to go there. Because this is where the story stops being a pure engineering problem and turns into a genuinely contentious policy and climate fight.
Right, so here it is. Many of these states, including Virginia, have renewable energy laws and clean energy mandates already on the books. If a data center builds its own private gas plant, is it quietly sidestepping those very rules?
That is precisely the question regulators and advocates started asking out loud, and there was a pointed report on July 20th of this year framing it bluntly, asking whether behind-the-meter gas turbines let data centers skirt state renewable energy laws entirely.
Let me play devil's advocate for a second, because I can actually hear the industry's rebuttal forming. They would say gas is a pragmatic bridge, that you cannot run critical AI infrastructure on intermittent wind, and that something has to keep the lights on today.
And that argument is not empty, to be fair to them. Gas turbines really are the realistic near-term option because they are dispatchable, they can run around the clock, and you can physically build them years faster than almost any alternative source of firm power.
But the counterpoint, which I think deserves genuinely equal airtime here, is that so-called temporary bridges in energy infrastructure have a very stubborn habit of lasting for 30 or 40 years once the concrete is poured and the capital is sunk.
That is the real worry that keeps climate policy people up at night, that a fleet of quote-unquote bridge gas plants built in 2026 quietly locks in decades of carbon emissions, all to serve models that themselves claim to be helping solve climate change.
There's a rich irony there that I do not think we should skate past. The idea that the technology so often marketed as humanity's great problem-solving engine might, in this specific moment, be driving a meaningful expansion of fossil fuel generation.
It is a real tension, and to stay balanced, the same companies are also making genuinely enormous long-term bets on clean, firm power, especially nuclear, which is honestly where the second half of this whole story really opens up.
I'm glad you raised nuclear, because I've seen a steady drumbeat of headlines about tech giants suddenly falling in love with reactors, which would have sounded absolutely unthinkable for Silicon Valley just a few short years ago.
The shift has been stunning, and the commitments are concrete rather than hypothetical. As of May of this year, 13 announced projects had committed more than 9.8 gigawatts of nuclear capacity specifically to AI data centers, and every major hyperscaler has signed at least one deal.
Walk me through the marquee names here, because I think hearing the specific companies and the actual dollar figures makes this feel a lot less like a press release and much more like a real, irreversible industrial commitment.
Happily. Microsoft signed a 20-year, $16 billion deal to restart 3 Mile Island, bringing back about 835 megawatts around 2028, and Amazon is putting more than $20 billion into converting the Susquehanna plant into an AI campus.
Restarting 3 Mile Island specifically is such a loaded and symbolic choice, given its infamous place in American nuclear history. So it really tells you how thoroughly the entire calculus around atomic energy has flipped inside these boardrooms.
It genuinely does, and the newer, smaller technology is coming too. Google partnered with Kairos Power on a small modular reactor fleet targeting around 500 megawatts, and Meta issued a request for proposals for somewhere between 1 and 4 gigawatts of new nuclear.
So we have this fascinating split-screen picture forming, with gas turbines racing to fill the immediate gap right now while nuclear gets teed up for the next decade. But the timing mismatch between those two things worries me a little.
It should worry you because that gap is really the whole ballgame. The honest expert consensus is that gas plants will cover the shortfall for the next several years, while small modular reactors realistically only start entering the mix after 2030.
which means the uncomfortable bridge that we were just debating a moment ago is not a hypothetical at all. It is essentially guaranteed to be built, because there is simply no other source of firm power that can plausibly arrive in time.
That is the sober reality, and it reframes the entire clean energy debate. The question is no longer whether we build gas to bridge this particular gap, but rather how much of it we build and how quickly we can retire it afterward.
There is one more thread I really want to pull before we wrap, which is the question of who ultimately pays for all of this. Because grid upgrades and brand new generation are definitely not cheap little line items.
That is maybe the most politically explosive piece of the entire story, honestly. Despite something like $1.1 trillion in planned grid investment, large loads still face decade-long waits, and ordinary ratepayers increasingly fear they will subsidize AI's power bill.
And that fear is not at all irrational. Because if utility costs rise to serve these massive new data center loads, there is a very real risk that everyday households end up quietly footing part of the bill for the AI boom.
Which is exactly why behind the meter is actually appealing to regulators in one specific sense. Because when a data center builds and pays for its own generation, it is at least not directly loading those enormous costs onto the shared public grid.
So if you had to hand our listeners the one clear signal to watch over the coming months, as this whole situation keeps rapidly developing, what would you tell them to actually keep their eyes fixed on?
I would watch the regulatory fights over behind-the-meter gas, because how a few key states rule on whether that skirts their clean energy laws will basically set the template for how the entire country ends up powering artificial intelligence.
That is a perfect place to leave it. A collision between the fastest-moving technology of our lifetimes and the slowest-moving infrastructure that we have. And I strongly suspect we will be revisiting this exact tension many more times.
We absolutely will, because power, not chips, may end up being the true story of this entire AI era. And I genuinely cannot wait to see which way these pivotal early decisions ultimately break for all of us.
That's all for today's episode of the DX Today podcast. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.